Hey guys, Brutal here. In my previous video, I showcased how to clear from Elder Leexa to Kragmaw the Infested, explaining what each NPC between those two bosses would do upon engaging them in combat, and how to murder Kragmaw himself, who, by the way, is definitely a Shrieker from Tremors 2, and 2 thumbs up to anyone out there who knows what I'm talking about. Now that you've killed the second boss of the dungeon, Kragmaw, the ugliest Shrieker of them all, it's time to start making your way to Sporecaller Zancha. As always, keep in mind this is not a one-size-fits-all guide, as each week's affixes will alter routes, pull patterns, crowd control, and much more. So use this as a general guide, and consider what changes take place from week to week to give yourself a competitive edge when a particularly difficult collection of affixes are present. If you recall, in my previous video, I mentioned if your group was still afflicted with the sated debuff, it'd be wise to pull some of the trash beyond Kragmaw's room. Either way, let's discuss what you'll be facing leading up to the third boss. The very first pack of trash you'll encounter is comprised of 1 Fallen Death Speaker and 3 Reanimated Guardians, 2 types of NPCs you've yet to encounter in the Underrot. The Fallen Death Speaker is your primary target on this pull. They have 2 abilities, Raise Dead and Wicked Frenzy. Their toolkit certainly isn't overwhelming, but it's important you understand it nonetheless. First, you need to simply interrupt the Raise Dead cast. If it goes off, an additional Reanimated Guardian is summoned, which means you get to kill an entire extra NPC that's worth absolutely no additional enemy force count. It's simply a waste of time. Secondly, stunning, or something similar, to the Wicked Frenzy cast prevents the Fallen Death Speaker from not only being buffed and attacking with 100% additional haste, which is bad in and of itself, but it also prevents the NPC from applying Wicked Assault to your tank, which is a magical debuff that inflicts moderate shadow damage every second for 10 seconds. It doesn't stack, but each time a successful melee hit lands, it refreshes the dot. While the dot can be dispelled by several classes, it can be avoided altogether by not allowing the uninterruptible cast to go off, so again, stun it. The other NPC I mentioned a moment ago, the Reanimated Guardian, it's very one-dimensional, but it does pack a punch. This NPC is constantly meleeing your tank, which obviously needs to be healed through, but it also has an aggravating little ability called Bone Shield. If a cast of Bone Shield goes off, a Reanimated Guardian will have a hefty shield applied to itself, which means that you have to deal a considerable amount of additional damage to kill it. This slows down the dungeon, putting you at risk of not meeting the 33-minute timer, but it can also lead to other complications during, say, Necrotic Week. The longer your tank must suffer attacks from an NPC, the worse off you are, everyone is. So interrupt Bone Shield when you can, cycle in your knockbacks, your stuns, etc., and you'll be fine. The next NPC you run across is a Grotesque Horror. It has a single ability called Deathbolt. If this cast goes off, everyone in the group will be afflicted by a magical debuff, which deals shadow damage every second for 6 seconds. Just stun or interrupt every Deathbolt cast and move on to the next pull. Speaking of the next pull, I should mention that you could technically pull about a dozen flying feral Bloodswarmers off to the right if you really wanted to, but it's largely a waste of time. I covered these NPCs in my previous video, so you already know how to kill them, and they can safely be ignored at this point in the dungeon. You have plenty of trash ahead to reach 100% enemy force count, just ignore them, please. Anywho, for the next pull in the dungeon, you have a choice to make. Do you go to the right and pull a roaming Fallen Death Speaker guarded by more Reanimated Guardians, or you go left and engage a different roaming Fallen Death Speaker with a Bloodsworn Defiler at his side? Or do you just say screw all of that and merely hug the left wall and skip straight to the boss? Oh my, decisions. If you do decide to skip all of this trash, you'll certainly have to make up the enemy force count at other points in the dungeon. And this trash is arguably some of the easiest throughout the instance, so again, as I've mentioned in every video at this point in time, utilize method dungeon tools and know what you're doing before you start your dungeon run. Going left or going right is perfectly acceptable, as either direction takes you straight to the boss. You just need to know what you need to pull to reach 100% enemy force count without overpulling. Many groups, in fact, pull everything in this area. So figure it out before the dungeon begins. With that being known, let's discuss the Bloodsworn Defiler. This NPC has a few dangerous abilities: Shadowbolt Volley, Withering Curse, and the ability to summon a Spirit Drain Totem. The Shadowbolt Volley is just what you expect. It's an AoE spell that, if it goes off, inflicts shadow damage to the entire group. This NPC cannot be stunned, but it can be interrupted, knockbacked, or death gripped, to name a few player abilities. Keep in mind, however, that if you do decide to knock it back or death grip it, it's just going to want to cast whatever spell you were attempting to deal with the moment it lands. Use those abilities to buy you time for your interrupts to come off of cooldown. Just remember that interrupting Shadowbolt Volley is equally important to interrupting Withering Curse. Withering Curse is a nasty curse debuff that not only reduces the damage you do by 10% per stack, and yes, it stacks, but it also increases the amount of damage you take by 10% per stack. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that nearing 10 stacks, let alone suffering from 10 stacks, can be deadly. Not only will you be doing little to no damage the higher the debuff stacks on you, but the amount of damage you'll be suffering is detrimental. Mages, shaman, druids, they can all remove a curse debuff from players. So keep your eyes open and be aware if the group takes a few stacks. Ultimately, it's up to the group to ensure that Withering Curse is handled appropriately, so don't fall asleep at the wheel. That last spell I mentioned, Summon Spirit Drain Totem, can actually be ignored. When the spell goes off, a Spirit Drain Totem appears in the area, and if a player is standing by it after 4 seconds, not only will they be stunned, but they will suffer extreme shadow damage, which, believe me, typically results in a death. Once that totem hits the floor and you see it, move away from it. It actually has a surprisingly short range, all of 6 yards, so just take a few steps away and you'll be fine. The interrupts are far better used on Withering Curse and Shadowbolt Volley. Keep in mind the first time you encounter this NPC, it's patrolling around with a Fallen Death Speaker, which also has one spell that needs to be interrupted, Raise Dead, and one spell that needs to be stunned, Wicked Frenzy. Coordinate, let your group know what you're about to interrupt, and don't get lazy. Every other NPC or pack of trash in this little area you've already dealt with. In the final pack you have the choice of skipping or pulling is a double Bloodsworn Defiler pack. Don't overlap your interrupts and you'll be fine. After those last 2 Bloodsworn Defilers, you've made it to Sporecaller Zancha. Once you reach Sporecaller Zancha, you'll only need to contend with a handful of abilities: Shockwave, Upheaval, Festering Harvest, and Volatile Pods. Before I discuss the boss's abilities, you'll notice that once he's been engaged, he summons a large ring of spore pods, commonly referred to as mushrooms, around the room. These mushrooms will absolutely murder you if you don't deal with them. But thankfully, the boss is stupid enough to cast abilities that allow you to blow up the mushrooms and remove them from the encounter. How fortunate. As the tank, you'll be responsible for Shockwave, a conal attack that inflicts physical damage to anyone standing in front of him. But it also destroys any mushrooms that it hits. So, as you can surmise, you want to aim the boss toward a pack of mushrooms to cause him to smash them into oblivion each time he uses the ability. It's also worth noting that a good tank will position the boss in a manner that hits the largest cluster of mushrooms possible. And a good way to do this is to bring him into the ring of mushrooms itself and face him toward a large pack. This is not necessary by any means, but it will help you hit more mushrooms. Upheaval is a debuff applied to the DPS players in your group. The only thing you need to do with Upheaval in the 6 seconds that you suffer from it is run away from the tank, as he'll be using Shockwave to destroy the mushrooms near the boss and drop the Upheaval on a cluster of mushrooms that would otherwise go untouched. If you stand in Upheaval after the circle appears under your feet, you'll be knocked up in the air and take physical damage. The damage inflicted itself isn't normally all that dangerous, but it does prevent you from being able to move for a moment, which could lead to you taking Decaying Spores damage. What's Decaying Spores, you ask? Well, if you ever touch a mushroom, or if you're ever hit by a volatile pod, which I'll touch on in a moment, you'll gain a stack of a disease debuff called Decaying Spores. It inflicts plague damage, lasts for 6 seconds, and it stacks indefinitely. Too many stacks and you'll fall over faster than a shaman in any form of PvP, so be careful, please. In other words, avoid gaining stacks by controlling Shockwave properly, dropping upheaval in the right areas, and avoiding the spores from the volatile pods. The volatile pods are the large red bubble-looking entities that spawn around the room, on the outside of the mushroom ring throughout the fight. After 6 seconds, they all explode and release 6 spore pods in varying directions. Weave through them, dodge them, avoid them, whatever. If you touch one, let alone a handful of them, you will accrue a stack of decaying spores. And as you already know, you don't want to contend with that damage. The only other major ability to discuss is the Festering Harvest spell. Every 45 seconds when Sporecaller Zancha reaches 100 energy, he casts Festering Harvest, which causes any remaining mushrooms to explode, each inflicting 1 stack of decaying spore per player. If you find that your group is faced with a handful of mushrooms for some reason, you can have a rogue use Cloak of Shadows, a hunter use Aspect of the Turtle, or even a mage can pop the mushrooms and then immediately ice block. Numerous classes and specializations have some kind of a way to save the group from this type of mechanic, so be ready if need be to pull off a pro gamer move. I should also inform you that from time to time, you'll notice one lone mushroom hanging out all by its lonesome. Feel free to walk over to it, introduce yourself, run into it, explode it, whatever, because 1 stack of decaying spore is easily healed through in most cases, and it prevents it from being applied to your entire group during Festering Harvest. Oh, and by the way, if you're running with a Mistweaver monk, revival can be a lifesaver. You're welcome. Rinse and repeat until the boss dies, and finally, you're ready to move on to the last portion of the dungeon. Congratulations. That's 3 bosses down, 1 to go, and the Underrot isn't looking quite so scary anymore, is it? If you have any additional tips or tricks you think I missed, please let me know in the comments below. Also, don't be afraid to ask for clarification, or if you think I'm mistaken about something, let me know and I will correct it in a future video. My name is Brutal. Feel free to share this video and the rest of my Mythic Plus guides with your guild, communities, your friends, and as always, be well.